Hello, welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me from his home in Arlington, Virginia is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Ndugu Paul.
How are you today?
I remain simple, easy, and as some of my fans have suggested before, an awesome son of Africa.
There's still a lot of protests on American streets in American cities. So much has happened as we speak. The people involved have been charged so far. At least that's a step. A lot of people have said that's a step in the right direction. Your thoughts on what has been going on, at least for the past couple of days in U.S. cities?
First of all, what is going on in some very interesting ways is a reflection of what the United States Constitution provides for. It provides for the freedom of expression, the freedom of assembly. It provides groups, for example, if they have grievances, to organize themselves, mobilize, and send a very clear message to their governors. In fact, it was the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. who once said in the 60s that when you see riots or you see protests, you're basically looking at a people using what they think is the voice that the authorities have refused either to acknowledge or cannot in fact hear. And so the fact that some of the significant changes that have occurred in this country have come as a result of people using their constitutional rights of organizing and mobilizing around certain social causes is significant in the sense that right now, we are basically pretty much like in the second week, aren't we?
Yes.
But you can see what is happening in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the epicenter, of course, of the protests, and the place where George, the man that is, at the center of it all, the place where George was murdered by the police, at least according to some of the video that all of us have pretty much witnessed globally, really. You can see that the authorities are doing their job. And as a matter of fact, it was Wednesday that the state attorney general announced that the charges against the policeman who held the knee against the neck of George Floyd, that the charges have been upgraded from third-degree murder to second-degree murder. If it wasn't for these protests, that probably couldn't have happened. In addition to that, of course, you know that the other three policemen, the other three police officers, have also been charged. And these are some of the things that the organizers, the family of George Floyd, and the protesters have actually been demanding. So you can see clearly that this language seems to be effective, and especially when you protest peacefully. And you know, it was none other than a former president of the United States of America in the 60s, early 60s, who himself was unfortunately killed by an assassin, JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He once observed that if you prevent peaceful change from happening, basically what you get, he said in his words, I think, is that violent change could be inevitable. And
Yeah.
so you can see that there are some groups who have tried to take advantage of the peaceful protests, looting, burning, police vehicles, burning businesses and looting and all that kind of stuff. But those are opportunists. Those are some types of people who are trying to essentially divert the attention from the demands of the peaceful protesters.
I've been glued to television for most of the week and watching different scenes, different scenarios play out in front of our eyes. But there are some key things that I thought were remarkable in the sense that some of the soldiers, National Guard, the police, these people in riot gear, in some cities in America, who in a way were instructed by their bosses to come and quell these protests, decided to join the protesters, laid down their arms, laid down their batons, said, you know what, we love this country as much as you love. We are also saddened by the death of George Floyd. What can we do to make this thing better? What is it that we can do together to stop the burning of our cities? Because at the end of the day, we live in these cities together. And to me, those are examples that I've never seen. I think it takes a leadership. I would like to maybe to get your thoughts on that.
When you talk about those types of police officers, they are calling upon their humanity. They are people who obviously would like to see social justice being done. I don't think that there are those types of police officers who could have the audacity of using their knees against a neck of a lawful, legitimate American citizen, resident, or immigrant, really, for whatever it is. Because after all, what had George Floyd done, really? We are told that he had tried to purchase something with a $20 bill that was fake.
He
But
might
let's
not
face it,
even have known because those bills are always flying around. This,
whatever it is, I don't think, frankly, that a 20 counterfeit dollar bill, or even $1,000 counterfeit dollar bill, and I might even add, even $1 million counterfeit dollar bill, is something that is worth taking any individual's life, really. Besides, the police officer is not a judge, is not a jury, he is not a prosecutor. He is simply a law enforcement officer. All he was expected of doing was, if there was a suspect in something, someone that had attempted to violate the laws of the city of Minneapolis, all he was expected to do simply is to arrest that particular individual. Arrest that particular individual and put him in a situation where that particular individual would actually be taken through due process. Because the last time I checked, this is a country that believes in law. It is a society of laws, not a society of policemen. It's not a society of police officers, nor is it a society of generals or any particular individual for that matter. It is a society that is run by the laws, which of course are reflections of the highest law in the land, the American Constitution.
speaking about Let's speak about some clauses in the Constitution that guarantee certain freedoms for people to protest, people to express their views in whichever way or form, as long as if they're not distracting people's property or doing something that is unlawful.
Mm-hmm.
They're allowed by the Constitution to go out there and protest. And we've seen these protests, but at the same time, there's been a lot of a backlash, especially from the leadership of this country, saying that enough is enough. They've had enough. They can't afford to see more people on the streets, and therefore, uh, some people in the leadership of this country have suggested that maybe they should bring in soldiers, which is maybe you could also speak about uh, the powers, the separation of powers, because some governors have clearly said, you know what, no, we are not going to accept this, and we are not going to bring our national guards to police people. A lot of people, I see a lot of comments on Facebook who want you to clarify something like that for them. What does it mean to have separation of powers?
You know, those separation of powers were actually put in place to make sure that this American Republic, the United States of America, is not a kingdom, is not a monarchy, just like the kingdom that it had fought and eventually separated from. It had been, of course, as you recall your history, it had been part of what was then called the, basically the empire of the British, which was basically referred to as Britain presiding over an empire where the sun never set. As a matter of fact, these United States of America were the first to separate from that particular empire.
Mhm.
And in the eyes of many countries that were under the colonial administration of that particular empire, it was a very, very progressive precedent. America was a country that was respected by people who were under the British rule throughout the world. And part of the reason that this important document called the Constitution brought in the inbuilt checks and balances was precisely because they wanted the power to belong to the people. They wanted the people to be the sovereign, to be essentially the primary stakeholders in the republic.
Mhm.
They did not want a president sitting in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in the White House to be a king. Nor did they, nor did they even want something close or akin to what some would characterize as an imperial presidency. They wanted the president of the United States to be a servant of the people of the United States, and the president of the United States to account to his or her bosses. I might insist, of course, on the pronoun his, because ever since the founding of the Republic, no female has had the privilege of serving in the White House as Madam President. So the reason they brought about checks and balances was simply because they really wanted the people to enjoy the freedoms.
Mhm.
And therefore, they had three basic branches of government. They had first the executive, and the executive was headed by a president. That president was supposed to be working with Congress. Congress had two houses, it had the upper house, which is called the Senate, and the lower house, which is called the House of Representatives. Then it also had the judiciary system, headed by a chief justice who was independent from the chief executive, who was also independent from the Speaker of the House of Representatives. So these three branches of government were supposed to work together in a manner that complemented and supplemented one another on behalf of the people of the United States. It was allowed, of course, that at some point there could be some disagreement. For example, there are situations where the House of Representatives will pass a bill into law. They would want to pass a bill into law, and then that particular bill will move to the Senate. And the Senate would probably also endorse the efforts of the House of Representatives. What is left before the bill becomes law is the signature of the President of the United States in the White House.
Right.
So at some point, the President can either decide to sign, and if he can't sign, if he can't sign, then it means the bill cannot turn into law. And if he can't sign, that particular bill could be overridden by a 2/3 majority.
Is that why we see a lot of governors publicly and maybe privately opposing some of his policies?
You know, when you look at the Constitution of the United States, power is not concentrated in the hands of the executive. There is a fairly good sharing of power in these United States of America. As a matter of fact, some constitutional scholars will tell you that when it comes to domestic politics, the presidency of the United States of America is probably one of the weakest, because domestic politics gives a lot of powers to individual states. There are 50 states, and each of these states is almost like a nation. It is in charge of a lot of domestic policies, whereas the federal government, for the most part, really deals with national security, which means defense and international affairs. The President of the United States, for the most part, is very, very powerful beyond the borders of the United States. When it comes to international affairs, it is the President of the United States. Whereas, in fact, when you look in comparison to his counterparts, for example, across the Atlantic, you will find that most of those heads of state or heads of governments as prime ministers and what have you have a lot of power within their boundaries. But when they go to their international airports, they have almost absolutely no power to talk about.
Interesting. Now, let's go to some questions from some of our viewers. Let's start with Onyesige Nixon. He wants you to address the issue of inequality and race in America.
There is no superior race in these United States of America, at least as per the Constitution. The Constitution, as a matter of fact, apart from the beginning, even though it said that all men are born equal, it clearly did not provide for non-whites in particular being counted among the men. It took so many different amendments, including for the African Americans. It took the protests of the 1960s, national protests, just like we are seeing right now, for the Civil Rights Bill to be adopted and to pass into law. As a matter of fact, it even took a couple of assassinations. It took, for example, the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. It took the assassination of his brother, who tried to take his job, or his former job, Robert Kennedy, who was assassinated in Los Angeles. It also took the assassination, for example, of a man we talk about a lot, someone that is considered by scholars the conscience of America, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in Memphis, Tennessee. It took a lot of terrible things before that civil rights bill was passed into law, giving full citizenships, including the right to vote, for example. The right to have a vote, so that even if you are an African American, you have the same right as a white American or an Asian American to vote for somebody who was running for president, to vote for your senator, to vote your congressman or woman, and at different levels. The good thing is, it's like its constitution is like a shock absorber. It allows for people to express themselves without intimidation, without, for example, like what happens when we try to do some of these things in some of the countries where we come from.
How would you respond to a comment here from Irene? She says that why are all these black people making noise? If they don't like it so much, we can trade places. I would love to come to America, for example.
I hate to say it, my sister Irene, but that is really a very naive observation. First of all, African Americans, yes, they may be black like you and me, but they belong here. They are American citizens. They have distinguished themselves in so many different areas.
Right.
They do not need to be patronized by anybody. And nobody should question their citizenship or their right to serve their country. They have served with distinctions at every level that you can think about, including 2 terms as president of these United States. We are talking about Barack Hussein Obama Jr. They have had people, individuals that have served on the highest court in the land. The first person was Thurgood Marshall. He was appointed by a man who was called LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. In fact, and I think, even this time around, we shall overcome.
Let's go to another commenter. Let's go to Tanzania, Damascus Petro in Tanzania. Shaka, you made a reference earlier to Martin Luther King Jr., but how would you analyze the current situation? Is the movement, is what we are seeing with Black Lives Matter the same movement as what Martin Luther King Jr. stood for, or things have changed and taken a different turn?
I think it is not necessarily the same movement, but essentially the issues are pretty much the same. We are talking about social, economic, political justice here. And in the days and in the generation of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., they were in fact fighting for those same values, those same ideals. And by the way, even when you look at one of the largest marches that any particular individual has actually held in this capital of the United States, Washington, D.C., and it was Martin Luther King Jr. in the early 60s. It was, for example, a protest, not only by Black Americans or African Americans, but you also had white brothers and white sisters in those marches. And even today, I am delighted to say, and very proud to say, that you are beginning to see that in fact what is at stake is not only for Black Americans, rather it is for the citizens of the United States of America. It is multiracial. You are beginning to see some of these protests with, in addition to African Americans, white Americans, Asian Americans, Latino Americans. When you talk about racism, really, to some degree, it reminds me of the issue of ethnocentrism, popularly known as tribalism in Africa. Because when you look at tribalism or ethnocentrism, or you look at racism, essentially the idea is for the race to want to dominate, for example, the control of resources, want to dominate the power, for example, to create opportunities for advancement. So is tribalism. It's about control of resources. So it's about the power to control the distribution of resources. It is about the power to control the idea of offering or providing opportunities for people to advance.
What lessons could African leaders learn from ongoing demonstrations of the murder of a Black man? Should African leaders who have overstayed their welcome be concerned about these demonstrations?
I think, as a matter of fact, Africa, not just African leaders, but Africans in general, they should be part of what is going on, in the sense that they should, in fact, lend solidarity to their cultural cousins, the African Americans. Just in the same way, by the way, back in the 1940s, 1950s, when you look at the history of independent Africa, you may be surprised that when you talk about the founding fathers, like the Osajefo, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Dr. Nandi Azikiwe of Nigeria, these are two people that became the first presidents of their countries, actually. When you talk about Dr. Hastings Kamuzu Banda, these were people, when they were undergoing their university and college studies in the United States of America, or at some point in the United Kingdom, they were inspired by their cultural brothers, the ones that you now call African Americans. And so, if African Americans could actually lend a political sort of shoulder to African founding fathers, I think it makes sense that Africa should pay back by also supporting the causes of their cultural, political cousins, the African Americans.
Thank you so much, Shaka. You've been a great guest.
Thank you very much, Paul.